Hi everyone, so I started releasing my first build guides for the launch of Diablo 4. I have already put out my Death Trap Rogue endgame guide that I believe to be one of the overall best builds in the game, especially on the Rogue. And I unfortunately do not have time to go through all of the builds that I made here in the last weeks and months and make a full working Paragon setup for each of them. So we do have some guides here on Maxroll as well. They have like this Paragon embed. You can see the progression steps. You can follow our guides. But of course, first of all, not everyone wants to follow a guide. And second of all, not everyone wants to play the builds that we have. So if you have something that you cooked up on your own, then this might be a video for you. But even without that, I think it's really good to understand some of the basics of how these Paragon boards actually work, so that you get a bit of a feel of what is a good choice, what is a bad choice, and how to build them. So this is what I'm trying to teach you here. I've spent literally hundreds of hours at this point theory crafting builds, and that includes a lot of Paragon planning, a lot of looking at different nodes, looking at how to connect them, looking at when a certain choice is worth it. And I think I have a really good understanding of the game so that I can make Paragon boards very, very quickly, very accurately. What I'm trying to get across here is the bigger picture of how Paragons work. So let's jump into it. Now, you have to know that at the start, you always have your dedicated starting board. So every class has the same one, they just have the different nodes. So on the Rogue, I have this Rogue example here for my Twisting Blades build that I made. You always start out with like a very small board that has one socket and 4 round nodes. Typically, the boards that you attach are much larger, so you might have seen those. They have a socket, a legendary node that defines the board, so to say, and 6 round nodes. And around these round nodes, there are accompanying magic nodes. And in between, you have those pathing nodes that just give you a +5 to certain stats, which may not sound very impactful, but it does actually make quite a difference in some cases, which is when you start working with glyphs. But more on that in a second. What you need to know is that each legendary board is themed around a certain mechanic. So, for example, here on the Rogue, we have the Deadly Ambush board. And if you look at what this legendary node does, it gives you a trap effect. And equally, all of the special magic and rare nodes on this board have trap-themed effects. So you see this here, this one is literally called Trapper, gives you trap skill damage, gives you damage to enemies affected by traps. Then we have something like Spring Loaded, gives you trap skill cooldown reduction and arming time reduction. And then you have here damage reduction from enemies affected by trap skills. And again, you have damage to enemies affected by trap skills, and so on. Here and there, you may find some kind of defensive nodes. So here's Poison Resilience, for example. It's just res and life. So they're kind of like sprinkled in. There's also a bunch of like potion healing sprinkled in somewhere. But most of the time, these effects on all of these nodes on the board are themed around the legendary node. You see this here again, this is Cheap Shots board on the Rogue, gives you a crowd control damage effect. And then you may find certain nodes like Oppress here that also gives you damage to crowd controlled enemies, or critical strike damage against crowd controlled enemies. And similarly, you have the rare nodes here and here. So you see there's always this kind of theme that goes with a legendary node. And this means that when you are starting out with a character and you're pathing up towards a gate, at this point you will be able to choose your next Paragon board. All of them are unlocked from the start. You can choose and attach, and you can rotate them as you like. And you should always go with something that kind of fits into your build. In the case of this Twisting Blades build at hand here that I'm talking about, this actually uses Poison Trap, for example. So I actually attached the trap themed board first, Deadly Ambush, which has a relatively powerful legendary node. And also, I really like those damage reduction nodes that you can get here with Cunning in particular, and the Spring Loaded that gives you arming time reduction. So generally, as you progress, you're trying to pick up more and more synergies that go with what your build is supposed to be. The Paragon board is mostly a tool to optimize and increase the power of your build, and it's not so much very build defining. Of course, there can be a few cases where you have like very impactful legendary nodes, but most of the time they are, just kind of like synergizing, giving you maybe more damage, more defense or something like that, and not really making a build so much on their own. What you need to know at this point is that you generally only want to pick up legendary nodes that perfectly harmonize with your build. So for example, here we have this trap themed Deadly Ambush board. And if this is supposed to be worth it, then you need to have this effect pretty much permanently. So this means this should apply to all of your attacks This means you want to have your traps uptime really high for this to be effective. Because if you, just have your traps up like, let's say, half the time or so, at least when it matters, then this is relatively bad. This is a multiplier, so compared to basically everything else you can find on the Paragon boards, legendary nodes are generally multiplicative damage, and everything else is just additive damage. And you do get a lot of this additive damage. So I talked about the damage buckets in another video. If you're not familiar with this, you should maybe check that out as well. But the bottom line is that all these effects that give you like plus damage, like plus 10% damage to enemies affected by trap skills, plus trap skill damage, plus damage on this, and all these kind of effects, they're all the so-called additive damage category. And you do have a lot of that. When you have very little, like when you're starting out at level 50, you have trash gear, you have like, maybe 100 or 200% or so of this value combined. But as you keep going and you level up, you get better loot, you get higher level items that have higher stats, you upgrade them at the blacksmith. So just from your items alone, you're going to have like a few hundred of this already. And then later on come the glyphs that give you a massive amount of extra additive damage as well, as you can see here. This is actually one of the bit weaker ones that gives 90% additive damage to cutthroat skills. And there are other glyphs that can give you like 200% or something. Depends a bit on which glyph you're talking about exactly. But generally, you do get a lot of this stuff. In an endgame build, you're going to have probably something like 800 to 1000% additive damage. A lot of it coming from those glyphs and partly from your gear. So this means that at the start, these rare nodes are quite a lot more impactful than they are later on, because the relative increase, like going from 1000 to let's say 1015%, is very small. That's like a 1.5% damage bonus overall. Whereas when you have very little of it, let's say you have only 100% total bonus right now, and you add 15%, then that's a 7.5% relative increase. So this is the TLDR of damage buckets. You want to make sure that you stack very little of additive damage, because you kind of naturally acquire a lot of it, and you want to look out for more of those damage multipliers that work with your build. And one of those examples is the Deadly Ambush here. What it also means is that, especially early on in progression, when you're not farming a lot of nightmare dungeons yet, you cannot really level up your glyphs, and glyphs are very weak when they are not leveled. So at level 15 they increase in radius, they go from 3 to 4 radius, and this makes them a lot more powerful, because now you have a lot more opportunities to pick up these, for example, dexterity nodes in radius here. So you see here, this only gives 90% cutthroat damage, but you only have like 45% dexterity in radius. But later on in the endgame setup, we actually pick up more dexterity in radius, and then we have 70, and this whole thing is 140 cutthroat damage. And similarly, you can repeat the same steps with any other glyph. Whenever you put a glyph and it's not leveled, it won't be very impactful. So usually you want to try to level it up a little bit at least once you have unlocked one of those glyph sockets. And then you want to rank it up as much as possible, at the very least to 15 for this radius increase, because this just makes the potential of a glyph way higher. Early on, when you're starting out, those glyphs will not be leveled, they will be very weak, and you can kind of just like almost ignore them. So for example, in this case, here you can see that instead of rotating the board to path to the glyph first, even though I do pick it up later, I actually pathed up here to the trapper first, I pathed to the Deadly Ambush first, because this actually gives me a real value, versus those glyphs that are not leveled, yeah, they're not really that great. But in this case, I do pick it up anyway, and this would be like one of the earlier glyphs to level here, because it's already socketed there. Or you can also just put another glyph temporarily. For example, some glyphs are very impactful, such as the Exploit glyph, which I have on this build on a later board. So if you go over here, we actually have the Exploit glyph on the No Witness board here. And this is basically one of the most OP glyphs in the game that gives you the vulnerable proc. At least for barbarians, rogues and druids, it has this 3 seconds vulnerable effect when you engage an enemy, which is extremely powerful, because vulnerable on its own is a damage multiplier, and this Exploit glyph also adds a lot of extra vulnerable damage that actually goes in the same category. Other classes also have this Exploit glyph, so on the Sorc and Necromancer, but they do not proc the vulnerable by default. So it's a bit weaker there, but it's still such a powerful glyph that essentially every real endgame build needs to have this. It's just so much extra damage that you lose out on if you don't go for it. But as you can see, this Exploit glyph here is actually allocated on the 4th board. So this is quite late, you know, we're going to be like at least level 80 or something already at that point by the time we have our 4th board attached. So you can actually just take this and put it into another board early on. For example, you can try to make it fit with the starting board if you can. That depends a little bit on which stats are present. Or, for example, you can look at the other boards that you have attached previously. So once you found the right glyph that you really want, like the exploit glyph that I recommend leveling first on basically any rogue build, then you could also temporarily put it into a more suboptimal spot, for example here on the deadly ambush board. So you see there's a bunch more strength and radius, here strength and here, and you can actually make this glyph even work with a smaller radius. All of these glyphs have an extra stat requirement that you can see on the bottom here, where you need to purchase a certain amount of stats in range to activate the additional bonus. And in some cases, those additional bonuses are very powerful, but you may not be able to actually activate them on any board you choose. The thing is that it's very easy to actually move those glyphs back and forth. When you open your Paragon tab in game, you're gonna have like a little like a glyph tab, so to say. It's like your glyph inventory basically. And you can just like right click on a glyph and it will be unsocketed, and then you can just drag it somewhere else. So there's no cost or anything like that attached to it. So it's very easy to sort them out whenever you reach like a certain milestone or you find a new glyph. It's just something to be aware about, that some of these glyphs only really start doing a lot once they are leveled. And most of the time, they're not really all that much worth it when they are not leveled. But as you approach the late game, like close to level 100, you will have your glyphs leveled, or at least most of them leveled to at least 15, I would say. So unless you completely skip Nightmare Dungeons, which is not recommended, you will level up those glyphs, and then they really start coming online and they start transforming your Paragon setup. A little note at this point, there are also magic glyphs in the game that are effectively pretty useless. So they just give you like a few, like a handful or so of magic glyphs that have a smaller radius and no additional effects and stuff like that. They just give you a bunch of like extra damage or so. Generally, you will have no trouble finding them, at least when I played. I leveled up to 80 and I think I had all glyphs already found at that point for a while already. So they just start dropping basically as you go, starting at level 50. And when you unlock Paragons, you just find a glyph here and there and you pick them up. It's like a one-time thing and then you have them forever. Now let's talk more about optimal pathing, because this is actually a pretty significant factor here. So in some of those Blizzard previews that you might have seen from those Paragon boards, it did not really look all that good. And generally, you want to try to avoid pathing over these white nodes as much as possible. While the stats do stack up over time, you don't really want to like waste your points just trying to pick up random +5 something. And instead, you're always aiming for either those legendaries or the glyph sockets or those rare nodes and potentially some of those magic nodes that surround it. So it always depends a little bit on the layout of each board. They're all kind of like different, and some things are kind of like far out in the corner and they are really valuable, but you also have to travel very far to get there. So there are some examples like that. And there's others where you just have like some stuff on the way. Like this is one example here, for example, the Trapper. This is not something that I really think is very great, but it's just like literally 2 points. That gives me a bit of damage, and it's just like a kind of nice to have like on the side, basically. I wouldn't really go out of my way to pick this up, but since I'm pathing in here from the bottom, because I wanted to pick up the Deadly Ambush, and then also go to the socket, I'm kind of on my way there and just grab it. But there are other cases where you can definitely path quite a lot out of your way to try to get some of those extra nodes. Of course, you would never do that just to pick up something like potion healing or so, but some of these nodes can be very impactful. So if you're looking at, for example, my barrage setup here, there is a very powerful rare node called Nimble, which is on the Leirana's Instinct board on the Rogue. And I think other classes have that too. I think at least Druid. It gives you 10% attack speed and another 10% attack speed. So this is like a really powerful rare node, because attack speed, at least, you know, disregarding cooldown and resource management, is effectively a damage multiplier. And you don't really have that much of it. So you get 20%. It's almost like a legendary node, basically, right here in the center of this board. And there's also these smaller nodes that give you even more attack speed. So this is a really crazy pickup, and at least for rogue builds in particular, this is definitely something worth picking up if you can. If you are on this board, if anyway, for example, to maximize a glyph, and you have like a few leftover points, this is definitely nice to have. And for a node that is this impactful, you can definitely waste a few points pathing a bit longer than usual just to grab it. So in here you see, for example, this is like this combat glyph that I have here. This is for intelligence stacking. And then after picking up all those intelligence nodes here, I still had to path 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 points is actually not too much for how powerful Nimble is. I would say this would probably be worth it even if it was like 10 points away or so. So if Nimble was like maybe this located somewhere down here, let's say, so you have to like path like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more or so, it would still be a relatively good pickup, and maybe would even end up somewhere close to something else you might want to check out. So it's always worth looking around a little bit, seeing like what is actually nearby after you have found like a target to path towards. And as I mentioned, for example, sometimes you just pick up something that's literally right there, like right on the way. You can just path out there. Even if it doesn't do all too much, it's like a nice bonus. And sometimes, you know, you path over here to your target, let's say this glyph with those rare nodes, and there might be something else nearby as you go. I have one of these examples here as well. So this is a Tricks of Trade board on the Rogue, and I try to maximize the ambush glyph that requires strength. So you see on the first line, for every 5 strength, blah, blah, blah. So we're trying to pick up all the strength. It has 44. So this has a nice little overview here, how many stats there are of each type in the radius. This is always different for each of the boards. And in this case, we pick up these rare nodes here, and we are relatively close to something really powerful like Brawler. You see, again, there's only like 4 travel nodes, and Brawler is a relatively powerful node to have on a rogue, at least for a melee build, because it gives you damage reduction and a bit of extra additive damage. Again, this damage part here, like the extra damage, is not really that impactful because of all of the additive damage that we have stacked until this point, but damage reduction is something that you can always pick up, that is always nice to have. And the thing is that especially if you go for glyphs, you often end up relatively close to one of these exits. So you see here, for example, that this is the strength stacking glyph, and we're trying to pick up the strength here. And then it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points up to the next gate. So this would be like the natural path out towards the next board if you're trying to stack up the next glyph there. And this is exactly what we're doing here. You see this again. In this one, we put turf, which is also a strength stacking glyph. And then we have the path over here. This is another 5, 6 points, 7. And then he starts stacking the strength that he actually want for this glyph. So here, 7 points for like pathing to a gate is all right. 5 points is really no good. So this is kind of like the shorter path here. And of course, you would want to like path out all the way down here. Let's say this would be like 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 points, which is very far just to get to a gate. Unless, again, you have something on the way. For example, you might want to pick up Ranger, which is also a relatively powerful node. At least for a build that would attack from range as a rogue, this will be a very nice pickup yet again. Here I have an example of a druid board, and druids actually do have relatively powerful legendary nodes compared to the rogue that I think are generally worth picking up if they fit into your build. So we have an example of a polarized build here. So this is a Paragon tree that I made. And here you have like a really long winded path, as you can see, through the entire board. We picked up the Ancestral Guidance that gives you extra damage after spending a certain amount of spirit. So this is kind of universally useful for a druid, and this build spends a lot of spirit. So we want to try to pick that up relatively early because, yeah, right after the starting board, this is like a really strong damage buff. And here again, you have to kind of like path right by this healing node, which is not really great, but it's literally 1 point. So I would just pick it up, and then you go to this legendary node. And then we have something like, yeah, Spirit on Kill, which is very useful, maximum spirit as well for like an earth build, which this is. And you end up pretty close to a gate. Now the question is, would you actually path to the gate and then pick up other stuff there first, or rather finish this board first? That is kind of up to you. Generally, I would recommend to just kind of like finish with everything you want to do on a certain board, because it usually shows it for a reason, to try to stack up certain rare nodes, to try to stack up, the glyph with the legendary node together. And you see that sometimes, even when they are very far away from each other, it could be worth pathing all the way over there, because they have some good stuff on the way. So again, here's maximum spirit, and there's maximum spirit, and there's also a bunch of life. And all these are kind of useful stats, and there's very little like random pathing in between, even though it's so spread out on this board. And then you can pick up the glyph here, and potentially you could actually use this as a starting point to path out here and here as well. But in this case, I actually just went out on the right side here because that was 5 points. And almost always I ended up with like very few pathing nodes to the next board. So this is why I didn't actually do it here. In some extreme cases, you could also consider pathing in on the board from 2 different angles. So in this example here, like if I didn't want to pick up this rare node and this rare node, you could actually just like cut out this entire like middle part here, pick up this legendary, leave the board, and then you could do all your stuff here, you know, kind of connect it in a circle and here, and come back from the top and pick up the glyph if you want. You see, this is like a pretty short path. Here it's also a relatively short path. And yeah, if this is all kind of like worthless for your build, then this might be a really good way to doing it. I think I actually have done that on 1 or 2 of my boards. So as a few general rules, you always want to try to find stats that synergize with your build. So the Paragons do not make your build most of the time. They just like improve it and make it stronger and more tanky and all these kind of things. They're not really so build defining. So you want to pick up stuff that goes with what you already have from your skill tree and from your legendaries that you're trying to put into your setup. And never pick up anything that does not really perfectly fit into your build. Also, these additive damage nodes are generally not really impactful. They may be relatively good very early in the progression, when you're like level 50, level 60, and you have not really anything like that buffs your additive damage category, but generally they are very weak. So the real reasons to choose a certain Paragon board to attach and to rotate it around so that certain stuff is closer is either the legendary node or the glyph socket. Depending on your state of progression, you might want to go more for the glyphs or less for the glyphs. So especially early on, glyphs may not be leveled. You may not be able to actually put them in the right board and all that kind of stuff. So glyphs are generally kind of weak early and generally kind of strong later. So something to keep in mind. And the legendary nodes are also generally relatively powerful if they work for your build, which most of the time, unfortunately, they do not, or at least not all the time. And if they don't always apply and don't perfectly synergize, then they're usually not worth it. When it comes to picking up rare nodes, you always have to decide on what is the cost of getting there versus what you gain. Not all of these rare nodes are created equal. I gave you this nimble example, which is literally better than almost any other legendary node on the rogue sport. So this is one of those cases where you can definitely go quite out of your way to path there to pick up something like nimble. You could almost just choose this board here just to pick it up because of how strong this node is. But in other cases, you get basically trash that doesn't really do anything, or gives you like, you know, a minor bonus here, is a bit of armor, a bit of potion healing. Sure, if you spend like 1 or 2 points on this, it's not too bad. And finally, there are also those magic nodes that are stronger than regular nodes or have a special effect. So in the case of this druid here, there's even spirit on kill and these kind of things. But very often you just get like a bit more stats. So you get 7 instead of 5, for example. So they may be worth picking up for a certain like glyph boost, for example. Or you just get whatever the rare node also gave. In general, the structure of Paragon boards is actually very well defined and actually shared across classes. You're going to see this with an example that I'm going to give you. So this is the druid starting board, and the druid's main stat is willpower. Willpower is a stat that gives druids plus extra skill damage with a multiplier. And if you pay attention to where those main stat nodes are located, for example, for buffing this werebear glyph here that requires willpower, which is the druid's main stat, then you will see some interesting similarities. So here is the rogue board, where I also put main stat required glyph, the dexterity glyph ranger. So dexterity is the main stat for rogues, and that gives them the damage instead of willpower. Willpower is worthless on rogue. And now look at the distribution of the stats. You see here, for example, those 3 dexterity nodes, and you see the druid with those 3 willpower nodes. And again, you see here those 3 dexterity nodes on the rogue, and you see those 3 willpower nodes on the druid, and so on. So the boards are actually basically copy pasted. And this is not everything. I have another thing to show you, which is the layout of Paragon boards. So if you go to Lothric here, they have an overview where I can see the layout of each of the board at once. And I'm gonna show you how this looks on the different classes, which, well, maybe a little surprisingly at this point, is actually an exact copy paste as well. You see, those boards look exactly the same. They have the same layout, and on top of that, they have these nodes in exactly the same spot. They're just like flipped around. So whatever is dexterity on the rogue is willpower on the druid. And similarly, those other stats are also transformed. Here on the rogue, there are int nodes, and on the druid, there are dexterity nodes. So these are kind of like the medium stats for the druid and for the rogue respectively. So they are also just like flipped around. Here we have willpower on the rogue, and there's willpower next to the glyph here, for example. And on the Druid, there's Strength and Strength, and Strength is the weakest stat on the Druid. And the same goes for those glyphs, for example. So most of these like very generic, basic glyphs that just buff damage overall are usually based on main stat. So you see this here, this is the Ranger glyph that gives you just like damage to all marksman skills. And there's something similar, for example, for cutthroat skills, the melee version of skills. And yeah, a few other like dexterity buffing glyphs, but not that many. And equally, this dexterity-based glyph also requires dexterity, the main stat of a rogue, to actually activate the additional bonus. And you see here that it requires 40 dexterity in radius to activate, which on a rogue is relatively easy to achieve, but not so easy on, for example, a sorcerer. And there is yet another rule with glyphs and rare nodes. As you can see here, the rare nodes always give the main stat of a class. Here we get 10 dexterity, here we get 10 dexterity, and here we get 10 dexterity, and here we get 10 dexterity, and so on. They always give 10 dexterity, at least those rare nodes in range of a glyph. And then surrounding those 10 dexterity rare nodes, there are always either int or strength on the rogue, or similarly with the druid, we have willpower being the main stat on the rare nodes, and then there's dex and int. And the one that is not present is the weak stat of a class that is usually not really used for anything. And exactly the same system applies to all of the other classes. They all have their main stat on the rare nodes and then the two middle stats on the magic nodes around them. There's only one exception in the entire game that I know of, which is the no witness board on the rogue, which is probably a bug. I don't know what they were thinking here, but there is intelligence on a rare node. This is the only exception that I know of that actually does break this rule. So I see here there's dexterity and there's int for whatever reason, which actually may lead to some pretty interesting interactions, because there are glyphs that buff rare nodes and require intelligence in their radius. So I'm really curious how that actually works. But the bottom line is that this system is designed in a way that once you have understood the general rules, the general pathing, the glyph system, and how it kind of like interacts with each other, with when you want to pick up glyphs, when you want to level them, where to put them, how to maximize them, you actually understand Paragons for all builds, for all classes, basically. And there are some more rules to learn here that are actually quite useful. For example, there are those magic buffing glyphs. And you see here, this is a druid glyph. It also requires 40 willpower. And as we have learned, magic nodes never have the main stat of a class. So this glyph requires the main stat, and it can only buff not the main stats, because the magic nodes cannot be the main stats. They are int and dexterity in the case of a druid, for example. And similarly, all of those rare buffing glyphs always require something that is not the main stat, because the rare nodes do have main stat, but here, for example, the protector glyph gives a buff to rare nodes and requires 25 intelligence. And you also see that for the weaker stats, like those that are not the main stats, you only require 25 to activate the additional bonus, while for the main stats, you always require 40. And the thing is that whenever you pick up a glyph, you always want to try to maximize its potential. I mentioned this earlier with how they increase in radius, but of course, you want to buff it as much as you can. This is kind of the reason to have these glyphs. They are very powerful when they are leveled, and when you beef them up with those extra, for example, intelligence nodes around it. So you want to try to like pick up all of this stuff here, and then kind of like see where you land, and you can go from there. You know, in this case, you know, the glyph kind of dictates where you're gonna be, and then you can just path from there with the shortest path to your next destination. So you can kind of like add it together piece by piece as you progress through your Paragon boards. And again, you always should try to choose something that has the most synergy with your build as you go. So you see here that, you know, if we pick up these rare nodes here, this is like the first step in my guide. And then we go to the next step, we pick up this stuff. And then you always just kind of like go from where you left off, and you path out, branch out from there, and kind of like see where you land. Sometimes you may have like a certain node that you really want to pick up. So in this case, my spring loaded, that kind of like leads me to the gate already. And again, here we want to pick up, for example, the legendary node and the glyph. So I rotated it around to have this pretty close. I wanted to give the safeguard. So with all this knowledge, I'm going to wrap up this video here with an example of how I actually made this Paragon board and what is the thought process behind it. So in this case, we start out here at the starting board. We pick up the first magic and rare nodes, which is the prime here, gives us damage and life, which is just a nice pickup. And then you path over here because you're kind of like supposed to pick up the first glyph socket anyway. and the magical and rare nodes are right there, so you just kind of like take them anyway. Then you path out on one of these sides, because you don't want to do it on both sides, of course. And we want to get the deadly ambush board. So I mentioned the trap synergies in my build, so this was kind of the primary reason here. And you pick up this stuff, which is right on the way, even though it's not that great. And we go to the glyph socket, because this is actually a layout that is very close between the legendary and the glyph, so you can kind of just get both very easily with just a little bit of traveling. So very nice. And we pick up these rare nodes, of course, to go with the glyph. Now from this point, it would actually be faster to just path out to the top here. You see this is a shorter route, but I really wanted to pick up this rare node as well. So we go to the next step, and you see I pick up this rare node, and we also go to the next board from there, because now we are actually really close to the gate. And we can pick up the cheap shot there, which is also just like 5 points on my way, for example, through the safeguard node, which I really wanted, to the glyph. And the next step would be the glyph here. So you put it there, you pick up all the stuff surrounding it. It's all really close. You see it's like right there. Pick up the magic nodes. They're kind of nice. And you move on. And in this case, I think I attached 2 different boards here. So one is for the exploit glyph. So here we have a board that was only chosen to buff the glyph to its maximum, because it's the exploit glyph, the most important one on this build. And the no witness board has 54 strength, which is the maximum of all boards on the rogue, to buff this glyph in particular. So in that case, we try to attach it here with a bit of pathing, and we pick up the rare nodes because they're right there. And then later on, I'm also going to go back once the glyph is fully leveled, and we pick up even more strength in the radius. But from this point, you see that there's nothing really anywhere nearby that I want. Here's a bunch of controlled impaired duration reduction, bunch of damage to healthy enemies, but it's all quite far away. The gates are relatively far away. So I actually go back and path from another way here. So we path out to the right there, which is just a shorter way to reach the next glyph. And you put the glyph there and just kind of move on from there, which is just really close to the last board. And here at the end, you see some more examples of me simply picking up more glyphs and maximizing them, because this is already like quite late in progression. It's going to be like, level 80, level 90 plus when we actually attach board 5 and board 6. So this is going to be at a time when most of the glyphs are kind of leveled already. So you just go straight for the glyphs. There's no other like legendary nodes that really do anything for my build here. So you just pick up those glyphs and move on. Now there is one last consideration to make, which is the order of the boards. So you see here that each of those rare nodes has always a doubled bonus. So the first line can be doubled if you reach a certain stat threshold. So here it starts out very low on the starting board, needs 160 int. This needs 170 strength. So some of these nodes always need like the off stats basically, and some need the main stats. So there are some examples where you need, for example, dexterity here on the rogue, or even both. So this needs dexterity and int. So you have to kind of like look around and see what it needs. And those stat requirements increase. So a lot of people seem always like very focused on those like doubling effects of those rare nodes. And generally, of course, it's nice to have a doubled effect, but it's not a requirement, I would say. Especially when it comes to like later stages of the game, when you just try to like maximize those glyphs. These doubled stats are not really that impactful anymore. Yeah, you get like 14% core skill damage. As I mentioned earlier, with like, let's say 1000% additive damage or something, this is literally like 1, maybe 2% damage or something like that you can get by doubling this. So it wouldn't be worth it to just roll like, 300 intelligence on your items just so you can get this 40% extra core skill damage or something. You can just roll actual good stats on your items instead. And similarly, you don't want to like just start picking up random int nodes here and there, like 5 int here, 5 in there. That'll be a lot of points wasted just to try to get a little bit of a bonus here from this doubled effect. So it's more like you get it or you don't, but you want to try to put the boards in the right order so that at the very least in the overall picture, you get exactly those nodes that you really want with a doubled bonus. And typically, I would say that up to level 100, you can definitely count on at least 3 boards, probably 4 boards without much trouble to actually double the effects on those rare nodes. Later on, you might have to like actually go out of your way to stack up certain stats on your gear. You want to roll a bit of strength, you want to roll a bit of int if you really want to meet the requirements for board 5 or onwards, I think. But yeah, it's a bit hard to predict. But in general, you should just go with the boards that actually have like useful stuff on those rare nodes early on. So one of them here is an example of this damage reduction from enemies affected by trap skills. This is something I really wanted on this board, and I even improved it with the glyph that buffs the rare nodes. So of course, if you put a rare buffing glyph, it should only do that when you actually get the bonus and when you have two relatively useful rare nodes in radius. You don't want to put something like Diminish on the board where you only pick up one rare node and it doesn't even do that much. And likewise, I attached the cheap shot board here next because I really wanted the safeguard node, and I also wanted it to double, of course, because this damage reduction is very useful in the rogue. And there's also other relatively nice effects here to have with, yeah, damage reduction from slowed enemies, damage to crowd control. It's not bad to double these for a little bit of extra damage. But later on, especially on those glyph-only boards, let's call them, you don't really care much if those effects are doubled most of the time, if you just put like a glyph there and maximize its stats. And with that, I'm going to conclude this video here. So I hope that it helps you when you are starting out in Diablo 4. As I mentioned, of course, I have spent a lot of time video crafting. I know these things by heart, and it may be not that immediately obvious for someone just learning the game, but you can definitely get there. Once you understand the basics and you have looked at Paragon boards a little bit, you have looked at different builds a little bit, you will see those recurring themes, you see those recurring patterns across each of those builds, and you can kind of like figure out how to optimize it on your own as well. And this is really what I wanted to try to achieve here. I may make a follow-up on this video at some point later down the line when we have learned more about the game, when we have min-maxed all the kinds of builds and I've played a lot of more builds in the end game up to 100. Obviously, there might be more things to learn here, but for now, I think this is a solid foundation. I hope you enjoyed this video. I wish you good luck with the launch, and I'll see you guys next time.